Good morning, everyone. My name is Adonai Mack. I am the Senior Director of Equity Services for the Association of California School Administrators. I'm thankful that you're joining us this morning. We want to really bring you some information that we think is helpful as it relates to our LGBTQ students. And we have some wonderful guests with us to really talk about some strategies and some research that has occurred regarding our students. And so this morning, we have two of our members that are joining us. And we have a great presenter from the Trevor Project, Chris Bright, who will be going through several pieces of information and research regarding how our LGBTQ students are falling through the cracks during COVID. And so with this, I want to hand it over to Margarita Cuizon-Armelino to introduce herself and to also introduce our members who are joining us.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Again, my name is Margarita Cuizon-Armelino. I'm the Senior Director of Member Services for State ACSA, and I'm very pleased and very proud to be partnering with my colleague Adonai Mack, Senior Director of Equity, on this particular networking event. It is particularly close to my heart because I'm the mother of an LGBTQ child as well. And so this conversation is very important to me. And I'm very pleased to be working with two of our wonderful members from Region 13, who I will let them introduce themselves, and then they're going to introduce our keynote as well. So glad to have you here. I'll just be listening and learning, and we'll be sharing some thought exchange information with you when the time comes. Thank you. Michael, Steve?
Yes, hi, good morning. My name is Steve Bailey, and I am the lead ambassador for Region 13, and with my partner, Michael, we have been doing workshops throughout the state on LGBTQ issues in schools. And Margie asked us about this particular situation, or this particular concept, and we decided that I may have something to share with you about these kids who are in significant danger of not having the supports they have at school. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But I am the retired Director of Human Resources for Ventura Unified School District, retired in 2014, and have been a LGBTQ activist for, 40 some years, 50 years. And so I've seen a lot over the times, and what kids are facing right now in terms of being unsafe and feeling not recognized and helped is significant. So my partner take over. Oh, by the way, we are not masked and we are not socially distancing because we have lived together for 38 years and there's really no point.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Tapia, and I'm a retired principal from the Ventura Unified School District. And as Stephen mentioned, since 2016, we've been engaged in a lot of professional development involving LGBTQ students, staff, and families. And we're very happy and pleased to introduce our keynote today. Chris Bright, who is a Director of Public Training for the Trevor Project, has a great presentation for us. And so, Chris, take it away.
All right, everyone. Good morning. So let's dive right in. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We just did our welcomes and introductions. I'll teach you a little bit about what the Trevor Project is, what we do. We'll talk about COVID-19 and some of the intricate responses to that. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and then we'll wrap up. So it's a packed hour, and we're going to dive right in. So actually, let me quickly introduce myself. My name's Chris Bright. I am the Director of Public Education at the Trevor Project. My pronouns are he, she, or they. I use those pronouns interchangeably. And I've been with Trevor for 6 years now. Some of the services that we offer at Trevor include our Lifeline, our text and chat services that are all available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which allows young people under the age of 25 to reach out, get support with a trained counselor whenever they need it. And that's something that we're really proud to be able to offer. And it was in 2019 that all 3 of our crisis services went to 24 hours. Originally, it had just been the Lifeline, but young people are very much in a text and chat space, even more than they are picking up a phone. And so we expanded our services to match that. We also have a couple of other things that are not specifically the Lifeline chat or text that are still really important to the work that we do. We have Trevor Space, which is the world's largest safe space social networking community for LGBTQ youth and their friends and allies. We also have something called Trevor Research, and that's sort of like programmatic evaluations, the largest national study ever done on LGBTQ young people, and that's something that we do annually. Also Trevor Advocacy, which is our work at the federal, state, and local government levels. That includes publicly advocating for or against particular bills, or filing or joining amicus briefs on major cases, things like that. And then Trevor Education, my personal favorite, which is what I do with Trevor. My department is responsible for educating the public, raising awareness, and specifically addressing LGBTQ identity education as well as mental health education. And that's some of what we're going to be talking about today. So here's some common crisis concerns that exist just generally for LGBTQ folks outside of COVID-19, right? So these are just the normal things that a lot of LGBTQ folks are navigating. Things like not fitting into societal gender norms, whether or not that means that, you know, you're expected to express your gender a certain way, or you're expected to identify with the same gender that you were assigned at birth. When you don't fit into those expectations, society can be really cruel. We see families rejecting their children, friend groups rejecting them, even school counselors or teachers rejecting young people based on the way they express their gender. And those are big concerns for LGBTQ folks across the country, particularly trans and non-binary youth. The coming out process is also tricky. A lot of young people are coming out at younger and younger ages. And that age has been steadily declining over the past decade or two. And with coming out, there can be joy and excitement and celebration, but there can also be things like rejection from your friends, rejection from your family. And because folks are doing that at a younger and younger age, I think there's also less stability and less development of coping mechanisms that comes along with coming out. And so if that coming out process doesn't go well and your support system isn't there for you, you may have less coping mechanisms and less stability to sort of access to support you through that crisis. There's also things like LGBTQ related discrimination or victimization. Already this year, 17 trans women of color have been murdered for no other reason than their trans identity in the United States and the color of their skin. When you wake up every day knowing that, and that is your lived reality, you can imagine that that might weigh on you. The idea that if I step out of my front door, I might be killed or I might be murdered because of my identity. These are all things that weigh heavily on young people. And then there's some unique developmental stressors. Maybe you're the only person in your family unit who is gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. And oftentimes in our own family units, we're able to find people who have similar identities to us. But if you're the only person in your family unit with your particular identity, that can be a unique developmental stressor that LGBTQ folks are navigating. So those are just some common concerns that exist. But what happens when you encounter a crisis like COVID-19? What happens when you are part of a vulnerable population and the entire population now is in the middle of a global pandemic, right? So what we see is that folks with certain marginalized identities, based sort of largely on that marginalized placement they have in society, they're going to tend to operate a little bit closer to that crisis threshold, simply because their baseline interaction with society is that pushes them to the margins just generally. These are things like are folks like people of color, LGBTQ folks, women, homeless folks, undocumented people, folks who have little or no family support or financial support. Those are all people whose day-to-day life operates closer to that crisis threshold. Now, the other group that's lower vulnerability typically tends to be people who are white, people who are upper class, men, folks who are highly educated, people with a lot of support from their family or their friend group or financial support that they can access when they need it. So when they encounter a stressor, it's not that that stressor isn't a big deal for them. I think everyone can agree that our response to COVID-19 universally has been that this has been a big stress on all of us. But for those of us who are financially stable, for those of us who aren't dealing with murder or violence being perpetuated against us on the basis of the color of our skin or on the basis of our gender identity, when we encounter COVID-19, our ability to flex into that stress without being thrown into a crisis is more salient. And for folks who are maybe operating closer to that crisis line, now when they encounter COVID-19, it throws them over that crisis line. And that's why in the days, weeks, and months following COVID-19, our call volume and contact volume at Trevor has increased greatly. People are reaching out to us because they're encountering this new stressor that is throwing them above that crisis threshold that we just talked about. So that's one thing I want you to be aware of. On top of all those things that LGBTQ folks normally have to deal with, now we have this new stressor that's throwing folks into even more of a crisis. Now, what can you do about that? Well, one thing that you can do is practice empathetic listening. It's one of the most powerful tools you can put in your toolbox for supporting somebody. When you practice empathetic listening, it's going to let folks in your community know that you're safe for them to go to when they need support. And that's a really big deal because one of the number one things that LGBTQ folks need is supportive adults in their lives, people who they know that they can go to and trust. So in order to demonstrate that, you need to follow a couple of ground rules. One of those is using reflective or mirrored language. That way you're not unintentionally putting words in someone's mouth or labeling them in a way that isn't accurate. You also want to make sure that you're validating and normalizing the experiences that someone shares with you because, you know, a lot of LGBTQ folks feel like they might be the only person in the whole world going through what they're going through, and that's just not true. So validating and normalizing is a huge part of helping someone be more resilient. You also need to make sure that you stay present. If someone comes to you to talk to you, but you're too busy to talk in that moment, don't keep having the conversation but being distracted. Let the person know, like, this is such an important conversation that I want to make sure I can give it my full attention. Please, let's schedule some time later today or tomorrow to talk through this. And then always do your best to be non-judgmental. I know that it can be difficult not to judge folks who are different than us, but we have got to do that. We owe it to each other to not judge each other on the basis of our differences. Also, I encourage you to use something called a minimal encourager. This is like head shaking or nodding, saying, or like, yeah, that makes sense. Little like interjections like that. Those minimal encouragers allow someone to continue to know that you're listening and to express themselves without needing to come to you and say something like, are you listening? Are you even there with me right now? What are you doing? So those minimal encouragers are important without you taking over the conversation. And above all, if someone does express something to you, please make sure that you share care, concern, and encouragement for that person. If somebody shares something difficult and you're like, okay, now I'm gonna go grab lunch, like that's gonna feel really like a closing off moment for that person. And so it's important to respond with care, empathy, and respect. Now let's look at some things that I don't want you to do in these conversations. One thing I don't want you to do is to avoid or change the subject. If someone tells you they're gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, and you don't have one of those identities and you feel awkward or uncomfortable talking about them, so you're like, I'm gonna change the subject, that's gonna send a message to that young person that there's something wrong with them, that there's something wrong with their identity and that they shouldn't be allowed to talk about that with you. So instead of avoiding the subject, or changing the subject, I want you to lean into that discomfort and let the person know, like, I want to talk to you about this. It's important. However, don't let the I want you to talk about this turn into interrogation. Like, tell me about this and tell me about that and list all the things that you've ever felt in your life, because then that young person's going to be like, okay, I gotta go, because that's just going to feel uncomfortable for them. Similarly, try not to lecture. Young people get lectures all the time from adults, and it's just like not helpful. A lot of young people, especially young LGBTQ folks, are not empowered to take control of their lives and to make decisions. Instead, they get lectured by every adult in their life, telling them everything that they need to do. And eventually that shuts them down. It makes them feel like they're not going to be able to have any autonomy over their own decisions and their own identities. And when we're talking about identities, it's super important to empower people to explore that on their own. I also think we should avoid advice giving. We really oftentimes try to jump to advice giving with young people because we think that we are fountains of wisdom and that we know everything there is to know. But when's the last time that you went to your friend or to someone you trusted and were like, tell me what to do. I don't want to have any control over my life. I just want you to tell me every step I'm supposed to take. No, what you go to your friends for is for them to say, I don't even know what to say right now. I am just so glad that you talked to me or that you told me this. I'm like really grateful that you are coming to me and sharing this. Not here's this 20-step plan for how to get out of this situation. More often than not, we want to know that someone cares about us enough to listen. Similarly, try not to bright side this idea that like, don't worry, you know, things are hard now, but it'll get better later and you'll have such a great life, because it can feel super dismissive for like a freshman in high school to be told like, when you graduate and go to college, things will be better. It's like, okay, so 1/4 of my entire life that I've lived is going to be really hard and awful, but things will get better when I turn 19 or whatever. Like that feels like a very long time to be struggling, right? And so instead of bright siding that things will be better, or don't worry, there's a silver lining here, I encourage you to let that person talk about what's going on and think about in the moment ways that they can work through that pain and make things better now, not later. Definitely don't try to invalidate or change someone's mind. If they share something about their identity or they share something about what they're going through, it's not up to you to tell them that they don't have that identity or that they shouldn't be feeling these things. It's up to you to listen. Okay, so those are some really tangible tools to help people during this difficult time have conversations around their identities as the world around them feels like it's falling apart. But one thing that I want to teach you in terms of a helpful practice is using open-ended questions instead of directive questions. So a directive question would be like basically a yes or no, close-ended, I'm going to tell you how I want you to feel type of question. So you don't want to do that, do you? Or why would you want to do that? Or even like, you're going to start a fight if you challenge this person, so don't challenge them. Or if my boyfriend were doing that, I would want my boyfriend to stop. That's not cool. Those are all basically telling the person what you want them to say or what you want them to feel, as opposed to open-ended questions, which allow the person to answer not in a yes or a no, but in an honest and truthful way based on how they feel. So what do you think you want to do? Help me understand what's making you want to do that thing. What do you think would happen if you did this? Or what do you want him to do in this conversation, right? Those types of questions, because they're open-ended, they actually allow a young person to express maybe more than they would if you ask them really close-ended questions. And when we think about a big crisis like COVID-19, it's now more important than ever to keep those gates open wide so that a young person can tell you the ways that they're being impacted that maybe you didn't realize that they were even being impacted in the first place. So of course you wouldn't have opened that door for them. Now let's look a little bit at self-care and resiliency. So we always want to be promoting resiliency. And the truth is, if your community or the place that you belong has a focus on self-care and a focus on celebrating our differences, that's going to be the #1 thing that makes folks more resilient and able to lean into these challenges. So your schools, your school districts, the spaces that young people occupy should all have these types of protective factors. We're looking at things like easy access to competent mental health care, making sure that young people who are in crisis can see a therapist, or that young people who are in crisis have easy access to school counselors and social workers. Things like restricted access to highly lethal means for suicide. So I know in the state of California, there are more strict gun laws than maybe on the national stage, but we know that when guns are present, people die by suicide at a much higher rate. Similarly, certain types of drugs or medications that can cause people to die if they take them. Those are things that if you can control them and not have them easily accessible, you reduce risk for suicide. We also really encourage you to focus on community building and establishing events or spaces that folks will feel really strong connections with one another. So we're talking like Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or a GSA. We're talking making sure that you have theater and sports and after school programs and art classes and things where people can center around their hobbies and around the things that they enjoy and connect with other people in that way. Now, that of course naturally leads to things that happen outside of school. So positive media representation is one of those. Are people able to see themselves in the media that they are consuming? Are there positive and strong trans role models or gay role models? Are there books and television and movies that are easily accessible for young people where they can see LGBTQ folks thriving and making positive decisions for their lives? It's really important to highlight that positive representation when you find it and make sure that it's a part of your school environment. Make sure that folks know that it is okay to celebrate these identities is really, really important. And then last but certainly not least, please focus on ways to help develop healthy coping mechanisms. You've got to work on promoting a culture of self-care and something that's going to celebrate each other's differences. So if you feel like your school or your environment does not have a heavy focus on self-care, and that young people, when they leave school, are told, do your homework and come back to school and study at school and then go back home and then do your homework, and that's all this is all about, that's not creating a very healthy space for folks to develop self-care habits. It should be a part of everybody's night to do things that are separate from schoolwork, that are separate from their lives in school, and that are focused on their mental health and their self-care. So again, these are ways that we can promote resiliency, which makes COVID-19 less threatening for the LGBT community. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about where we can learn more. And for this, I'm actually gonna throw it over to my colleagues to talk through some of these resources.
Okay. So some of the actions that we can take as leaders include engaging our school communities in inclusive diversity work and professional development. And what you see on the screen are just a sampling of some of the resources that are out there right now. The first item is there are many books about the topic of LGBTQ. The first one listed there is Safe is Not Enough, which is really a great resource that came out maybe a year or so ago. Various organizations such as ASCD, Phi Delta Kappa offer monthly publications, and this one, Kappan from PDK, actually this particular issue focused on various issues dealing with sex and sexual identity. GLSEN offers a safe space kit, which is a great way to help students Anyway, and then the next item there is from Teaching Tolerance, which that particular document offers best practices in 4 key areas: policies, classroom culture, instruction, and family and community engagement. And GLSEN also every 2 years, their national school climate survey comes out, and it provides a lot of important data regarding how our students are faring in our schools. They survey approximately 23,000 students across the country, and they really gather a lot of data. Okay, and the next slide. Continuing with more resources. The Human Rights Campaign offers the California LGBTQ Youth Report, which one of the findings of this particular report was that only 1/3 of students in our schools always feel safe in school. They're also from HRC Latinx LGBTQ report provided information specific to our Latinx youth. Some interesting data out of that, 79% of our Latinx students feel depressed, usually. 73% of them feel hopeless, and 82% of them are nervous at school. The HRC youth report surveyed 12,000 youth, and 70% of youth in the survey reported being bullied because of their sexual orientation. And the last document from the Williams Institute, which is part of UCLA, they compared students, peers, LGBTQ students compared to their peers felt less connected to school. They experienced lower expectations from their teachers. They earned lower grades. They had higher absenteeism, and they used tobacco and alcohol at a higher rate than their peers. And continuing on, engaging in inclusivity work and more professional development. Some of the organizations that provide checklists and best practices for inclusivity are listed here. Welcoming Schools has 5 actually. Teaching Tolerance, PFLAG, that's Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. The Our Family Coalition, GLSEN, and ACLU. Okay, and on the next slide. It's important for people to be aware of the vocabulary. So some of the organizations, or just about everyone does, offer some type of glossary in terms of terms. Welcoming Schools offers 2 of them, one for educators and parents and guardians, and one for elementary students. The Movement Advancement Project, also known as MAP, provides an Allies Guide to Terminology, and that's what's pictured here, and it's probably one of the better resources in terms of terms are concerned. Teaching Tolerance also offers glossaries along with GLSEN and HRC. And then I think there are maybe 1 or 2 more slides. Okay, I'm just going to make one blanket statement because we have many slides and we're not going to look at each one, but it's important for us to enforce and implement various laws and policies that have been passed in the state of California to protect our LGBTQ youth. And we should skip all the way to the slide with the GSA network and GLSEN. Oh wait, no, go back, sorry, go back. Okay, another step that we can take is providing inclusive library collections in our schools and school districts. Okay, I think that's it. And then you want to talk about that.
And ACSA has a group of, a loosely knit group called the LGBTQ Network. And what it primarily exists for is to get information to people who are interested in LGBTQ issues. And you'll see a link to it there. It's hosted on Region 13 website. And we post resources, we put news links, and periodically we will connect with people through email about things that are happening. Last week, for example, we sent out notices about the Supreme Court decision upholding the fact that LGBTQ people now are protected in the working environment. So if you're interested in doing that, please check the website or the link, and we'll respond to you and get you information. You can also go to that link, and on that link, when you hit the website, you'll have a space for most of the resources we've produced here. We're in the process of updating right now because we've got a whole bunch of new stuff, but there's a lot of stuff there that you can access as well.
And then on our end, specifically Trevor, we have various handbooks or guides or support systems around various identities. We have our coming out handbook. We have a guide for being an ally to trans and non-binary youth. We also have something called the Support Center, which looks at resources across a myriad of identities. And you can access all of this on our website at trvr.org/resources. So now we're on to the Q&A section. That's how you can contact me. Also, I just wanted you to see me in a really pretty outfit. But you can always reach out to me at chris.bright@thetrevorproject.org if you have additional questions, because this was such a short opportunity for us to connect, and I know we won't be able to cover everything, but I'll throw it over to other folks to get the Q&A going.
I think what I'd like to do now is share the thought exchange that came through the pre-webinar survey that we did, and I'll also share the word cloud if you guys don't mind stopping for a few minutes to do that. Okay, hang on one second here.
I'll stop sharing.
Oops. Oh, thank you. All right, let's see. All right, so here is the thought exchange results of top thoughts. And the question we asked was, what do you believe is your obligation to LGBTQ students or colleagues, and why? And so the top 3 thoughts are, for students and colleagues, my obligation is to be an ally and create a safe space for both to be themselves in an environment that doesn't tolerate discrimination. It's imperative to support LGBTQ students. Access and equity starts with recognizing their needs and creating a safe space for life's expressions. It's our obligation to make sure everyone has an equitable education and work environment. And then the last thought was, all people deserve to feel valued and believe their gifts and talents contribute to the greater good. Too many of our LGBTQ plus students live in fear. Totally agree with that. So those are the top thoughts that came through on our thought exchange. And then the word cloud that it generated looks like this. And I would encourage people to, take a photo of that and share that out if they wish on their social media. But you can see that some of the words that pop out completely resonate with the topic, right? Safe space, support, lives, fear. So that's basically what the word cloud looks like. So just wanted to share that with you guys before we moved on to our Q&A. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
One of the things I think it's important to remember in this process is all the research we've looked at over the years indicates that kids feel safer at school with their friends more often than they do at home with their parents. And in COVID-19, kids are living at home with their parents 24 hours a day. And that becomes very stressful for kids, particularly if their parents are not supportive and they don't have access to the GSAs they have at school, or the friends they have at school, or the counselors they have at school. And so that's one of the reasons we thought that it was important to bring this information to you.
Excellent. I want to take the time to kind of dig in a little bit with all of you regarding services. But before I do that, I want to ask all of our participants if you wouldn't mind engaging us also and responding to this question in the chat box if you can. And here's one of the questions we wanted to ask our participants. Before COVID and before this pandemic occurred, what types of support services were you providing in your school district for LGBTQ plus students? Can you give us an idea about what those services were while we have our conversation with the panelists about looking towards the future and providing services? And Chris, I want to ask you to dig a little deeper into what type of services have you seen organizations provide, such as the Trevor Project, to meet the needs of our LGBTQ students?
So I think that one of the drawbacks to or limitations for us at Trevor is that young people have to know that we exist and they have to reach out to us in order for us to support them. And we don't get to look for warning signs. We don't get to reach out to someone who seems like they're having a hard day. We don't have that opportunity. And, you know, now that we're in the very real possibility that, you know, some schools won't be going back to school in the fall, or we might be having, you know, virtual school in certain aspects, the way that we sort of rushed to put together over the last 3 or 4 months. The limitations that Trevor has had, where we don't get to see people every day, is now the limitations that you all have. You don't get to see people every day. You don't get to look for marked change in behavior, or you don't get to say like, hey, you seem down today. You're relying on building relationships with folks and having those folks reach out to you without necessarily getting to observe their behaviors. And that's a really big challenge. And so I think now more than ever, you have to rely on making sure that people know about the resources like Trevor,
Right.
know that you're a safe person that they can reach out to, and to know generally what's available to them when they are having their own crisis. Because the most dangerous thing when someone is really in a low, dark place is not to have anybody or any resources to reach out to, not to be able to talk about what's going on in their lives and mobilize their network. And so I would encourage everybody to really think through with COVID and not having the sort of like in-person aspects guaranteed for at least the next little while, how can I make sure that folks know that I'm still someone who's safe for them to come to, even if it's virtually, even if it's, you know, in a Zoom link or something like that. So that's where I would start.
Okay, thank you. Michael and Steve, both of you are very experienced in providing and being an advocate for our LGBTQ students and experience in providing services within the system. Can you give me some examples of the strategies that you two used throughout your careers to support the students?
From my perspective, as the director of HR, I'm one of the few people in the room never in a classroom. I was on the other side of the house, but knowing and having people know that if they had an issue with something or they had a concern, they could come to me and feel safe, as Chris was saying, was very, very important. That my work was primarily with the employees of the school district, so I had that kind of connection. And one of the other things that I think was very important was to provide the kind of information and training that we could possibly provide to people, because everybody's at a different level when it comes to dealing with LGBTQ kids. And some people are comfortable with it and can deal with it easily. Some people are just not. And those people who weren't needed to have some information, some help, and getting to where they needed to be to help their kids. And so we provided that kind of information as well.
I think I've mentioned before that a lot of my advocacy really began after retirement, when I started doing more research about what types of supports there were out there for our LGBTQ students. And I was just amazed at the plethora of resources that there were out there, but yet I felt that they probably weren't being accessed. And I I have to give a lot of credit to Julie Vitale, who got the first LGBTQ administrator event going back in 2015, I believe it was. And she started this whole process of us being more engaged with LGBTQ and ACSA. One thing I will say is that we cannot wait until students are in middle and high school to address gender diversity. That we have to start in pre-K or K, exposing children to the fact that children are different, and that in terms, one of the easiest things that we should be able to do is really expose children to the fact that there's not only a lot of diversity in the world, that there are no girl jobs or boy jobs, that we have to really expose them to gender diversity and the diverse roles that they might play in our lives. And so as one of the authors of one of the books that we recommend is has said, Don Short from Am I Safe Here? LGBTQ Teens and Bullying in School, says the work of changing the culture of the school needs to start as early as kindergarten and continue through grade 12. And so one of the ways we can start addressing that in elementary school is by gender diverse practices for young children, making sure that they're aware of diverse career roles, that we're making sure that their play areas are not identified as this is for boys and this is for girls, that we avoid lining up by gender, for example, in the classroom, that we include literature for children with girls as leaders and boys as caring and supportive friends, and that along with diverse gender and stories, we include diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds in the literature that we provide our students. So those are just a few ideas there.
And you know, one of the things that's hardest to do on an organization like a school district is to change the culture of that school district.
Right.
And we had the opportunity, both of us, working under Dr. Trudy Arriaga, who was amazing at doing this. She's written a book called Opening Doors, does a lot of work with ACSA. But you know, in the 14 years she was superintendent, the culture of the district we worked in changed significantly from one of traditional, you know, this is boys and girls, this is all that kind of stuff, to really valuing everyone. Obviously, not everyone bought into that, but more people did than didn't, which was an improvement. And that to me was one of the most exciting things I've ever seen in my life happening. And I was part of it because as executive cabinet, we worked on it. But the reality is that people actually did change their minds. And you need to have some kind of familiarity with the people that you don't know who are different from you to actually come around to believing that everybody really is the same. Everybody really is equal. And, you know, as long as you stand on the sidelines and don't engage, you're never going to get to that point.
Thank you. You must have been reading my mind, because my next question was going to be, how do you address the adults? And so I really appreciate that. And I want to ask Chris, I want to ask you sort of the similar question. How do we address the adults, and what needs to occur with the adults in the system? But before you answer, I just want to point to the chat. There's a lot of great resources, so we appreciate you providing your examples of how you're meeting the needs of our LGBTQ plus students. And also, if you have a question, please post that, and we'll do our best to try and answer some of the questions that you post in the chat box. So Chris, I wanted to go to you, and let's talk about a little bit about what the adults need to do, and how do we prepare our adults to be supportive of our students?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we all need to do, and I do mean all of us, is look for any bias or prejudice that we hold within ourselves, and intentionally dismantle that. I think a lot of us might say, you know, no, I'm not biased against the LGBT community. I don't have homophobia or transphobia within me. I'm not a racist person. I'm not a sexist person, all the different things, right? But the reality is those behaviors are socialized and learned behaviors. Those are things that we all have. And to act like we don't have them is actually doing all of our kids a disservice. Because when a young person comes to you and you respond in a biased way and you didn't even realize that you were doing it, you didn't do it intentionally, you still impacted that young person's life. If you said something that seemed like you were uncomfortable with gay people, if you said something that seemed like you didn't actually think that that trans person's gender identity was real or true, then what you've just done in that moment is told that person, I am not worth it. I am not worthy of your respect, and you're not a safe person for me to come to. And so the number one thing that you need to do today, right now, before the school session gets back in, is look for your bias and dismantle it. Lean into whatever feelings you might have that are anti-LGBT and get rid of them. And then continue to do that work in your policies, in your relationships with your peers, and in the education that you provide for not your students, but for one another. Because listen, I am literally someone who travels the country pre-COVID, educating people about LGBT identities, and I still have things to learn about LGBT identity. So I am not sitting here saying that I am the end all be all and I know everything there is to know. What I am saying is I put in that work and I do the best that I can. But when I identify bias, when I identify sexism or racism or anything within myself, it is up to me to address that. And I think we have to be super intersectional about our approach to LGBT identities, because LGBTQ youth are intersectional. You have LGBTQ youth who are Black. And I know that all of us have seen the Black Lives Matter movement in the past month and what has been going on in our country in the past month. And to think that those two things are siloed and different, well, I can tell you that for your trans Black students, they don't know how to separate those two identities out because they hold both of those identities. And they're not going to be able to tell you which identity is more important to them. They're going to expect you to be able to show up for both identities. And similarly, you could look at anything else and say, when we hold multiple identities, those impact us really heavily. And if they find out that their teachers, their administrators, or their school counselors are biased against one of their identities, then they're not going to trust you. So, you know, I lean very heavily into an anti-bias framework because we all have biases and we act upon those when we're not even realizing that we're doing it. So the number one thing is to educate yourselves about what your biases are and then stop acting on those.
Right. Man, Chris, thank you. That's so powerful. I'm sorry, Steve. I just want to comment and say that Chris is powerful.
Who were uncomfortable with LGBTQ people is to just ask them to calmly ask, why am I feeling this way? And sometimes it's religious, sometimes it's the place that they're brought up in. And, you know, is that really a cause for feeling this way? And do you know any gay people? Have you ever had any contact with gay people? You know, we discovered during the various campaigns, Proposition 8, Proposition 22, that when people met gay people who wanted to be married, all of a sudden, they weren't so sure they were opposed. And it's a case of, you know, I don't know people like that, so they're not part of my world. And actually, everybody in this world knows gay people because they're everywhere. We're all everywhere. And a lot of people don't recognize that, and a lot of people don't come out and say, I am gay. But the fact is, this person living next door to you who you think is a great person might very well be gay. And you have to question why you would dislike other gay people if you like this person.
And Chris, I'm glad you brought up the issue of intersectionality because, you know, as a Latino gay man, that is something that is it's part of me. But I will tell you that I think this is not surprising, but LGBTQ students of color face more discrimination than their white peers. That's across the board. It doesn't matter if you're Latinx or you're Black, Asian American, Pacific Islander, or Indigenous, Native American. It's the same. It's greater. And so that just you talked about stressors before. That's part of that stress package. We get the package deal there. So. But I will say that, you know, every summer I'm looking for, I look at the various organizations' website and look for new resources. And I just discovered today that GLSEN actually has a series called Erasure and Resilience, the experiences for LGBTQ students of color. And they have 4 different publications. One has to deal with Black LGBTQ kids, Latinx, Native and Indigenous peoples, and Asian American Pacific Islander. I just downloaded and printed all 4 of them this morning. and they will serve as a reference point. But they provide, each of those documents provides additional data as far as what these particular groups of students are experiencing on a regular basis in their school settings.
And for those of you who we've talked about GLSEN a lot, that's a gay, lesbian, student, straight educators network.
Yes.
Cool. Excellent.
And it's
Thank
a great
you for that resource.
Yeah, thank you. I have a quick question. Can I just jump in here real quick, Adonai?
Yeah.
I want to go back to what Chris mentioned in his slide with regards to self-care. You said something about safety planning. Can you expand a little bit on what that means and what that looks like?
Yeah, so safety planning is an important part of self-care, because when you are in the middle of a crisis, figuring out what to do about that or where to go is a lot more difficult. But if ahead of being in a crisis, you said, okay, you know, if I get kicked out of my house because I am, you know, transgender, I will go to my best friend's house. They've already told me that I could stay the night with him if I need to, right? That is maybe not going to happen. Maybe you come out to your parents and they're like, you're amazing, I love you, you're the best, and everything's great. But if you did get kicked out, having that safety plan allows you to flex into a crisis in a way that you maybe wouldn't have the mental faculties to be able to do when you're in the middle of that crisis. So safety planning is all about setting up the things that you'll do in case you encounter a stressor or enter into a crisis. And so we think about safety planning for LGBT folks a lot about safety planning around the coming out process. If you tell your principal that you're transgender and they say, we're not going to give you all gender restrooms, we're not going to allow you to play on the football team, and we're not going to allow you to change your name and pronouns in your classes, what will you do? Because your principal is a power figure in your life as a student. They hold power over you, and you don't get to just like change their mind necessarily. And so unfortunately, sometimes safety planning is about working against the crisis before it arises. Now, all of you in the scenario I just gave, you don't have to be the principal who provides 0 resources for a trans person. You should be the principal who's like, all right, let's talk resources. Let me see what I can get for you. But my point is, for LGBTQ young people who don't have any safety plans in place, it's a lot more risky when they enter a crisis. And so that's where we're getting at with that, is like, think through the possible outcomes and then lean into those safety plans when you need them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Michael, would you do me a favor? You just mentioned a resource from GLSEN about students of color. Do you have access to that link? We'd love to see it posted onto the chat box for everyone.
I can tell you how to, I can just tell people how to access it.
Okay.
It's a GLSEN.org. And when you get to the website, you go into the research link, and it's on that, it's in that section of research.
Excellent.
And like, oh,
Perfect.
and into the document.
See, someone did it.
Oh,
Perfect.
cool.
Thank you.
And as you scroll down, not only do they provide access to the document, but there's also a video, roughly an hour long for each group, that they include on their webpage, so you can watch. And I haven't had a chance to watch those yet, but I'm looking forward to looking at those as well.
Excellent. We're getting really close to our time, and so I wanted to offer each of the panelists and Margarita an option for some last words. And so we'll start with our members first, and then we'll end with Chris. So Steve and Michael, do you want to have some last words as we finish this morning?
Yeah, I have one video I'd like people to see if we could. And for me, the most important thing dealing with kids and dealing with other people is becoming an ally. The LGBTQ population is obviously a minority population. We need the majority population to be allies. And if Josh can show the ally video, it's about a minute long. And this
Go ahead, Josh.
it's controversial, but on the other hand, I think it's important for educators to listen to this and understand what they're saying.
As educators, we know that so many of our students come to school for so much more than just an education. They look to us for inspiration, for encouragement, for support, and sometimes even love, which is why it is our duty to ensure that every student feels safe when they enter our school, regardless of race, religion, or sexuality. Over 40% of homeless youth are LGBT, many of whom ran away because their families didn't accept them. And an LGBT youth is four times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peers. No one wants to see another young adult take his or her life because they feel alone or because they feel society doesn't accept them. Which is why we as educators must openly and proudly support the LGBT cause in class, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it will save lives. And if you feel like it's not in your place to comment on social issues, or if your religious views conflict with your role as an educator, then you shouldn't be an educator. So to all my fellow educators out there, please openly and proudly support all your students, but especially your LGBT students, because they desperately need us too. And we may be the only ones who do support them.
And that to me is the most important thing I had to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll just quickly say that I think whatever we can do to make sure that our kids are not just safe, but accepted for who they are. And however we do that, whether it's in enforcing and implementing various laws that have been passed here in the state of California, SB 48, the FAIR Act, there's still a lot of districts dragging their feet as far as implementing the curriculum for social studies that is LGBTQ inclusive, and just really doing whatever they can to support our kids, because most school districts have mission and vision statements, and usually there's some reference to all students or every student, and they really need to make sure that they are following those vision and mission statements and are doing what they say that they are doing for all students, each and every child. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Chris.
I would say, on top of reframing and restructuring your beliefs and your own sort of strategy for unbiasing and supporting youth, I also think it's important to be aware of all the resources that are available, including resources like Trevor's, to make sure that you can connect young people to trained, supportive, trusted counselors and resources, because if young people don't know that these things are out there, it can literally be the difference between life or death. And I'll stop there, but thank you everybody. I do have to run to another meeting, so I'm gonna hop off, but I so appreciated everyone's time today. And remember, you can always email me at chris.bright@thetrevorproject.org if you have other questions.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Chris.
Any last words, Margarita?
No, just wanted to say, I'm really glad that we're able to provide these types of resources and networking events. As the head of member services, I'm very proud of the work that the organization is doing in terms of all of the equity networks and resources that we're putting out. And I would encourage our members to remind all of their colleagues and their colleagues who are non-members of ACSA to just remind them about the value of ACSA membership.
Cool. I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. Again, we are having conversations that are important for our students. The time is now for us to care for our students, to be advocates for them, to ensure that they're in an environment that they can learn and be successful. And this is specifically important for our LGBTQ students. So this is just the initial foray into us providing resources for you to educate our LGBTQ students and provide supports for them. And it doesn't stop here, and it won't stop here. So be on the lookout for whether it's our networks for bringing our administrators together, whether it's webinars, whether it's specific trainings that ACSA can provide, or whether it's a list of resources for you to access. We will continue to be advocates for all of our LGBTQ students moving forward, and we're looking for our allies in this fight. Thank you for joining this morning, and we will see you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.